At dawn in the Caribbean, a silent helicopter raid exposed a hidden oil empire fueling sanctioned states and terror networks. U.S. Special Forces seized a tanker hiding sanctioned oil flows, revealing how shadow fleets quietly finance regimes, terrorism, and geopolitical defiance. At first light on December 10, 2025, the Caribbean Sea looked deceptively calm. Low waves rolled beneath an open sky as a large crude tanker cut slowly through international waters off Venezuela's coast. Then the sound arrived. Rotor blades. A helicopter descended from above, its shadow sweeping across steel decks that had carried secrets for years. Within moments, U.S. Special Forces were fast roping onto the vessel. FBI personnel moved alongside Coast Guard and Homeland Security teams, weapons low, commands precise. There was no resistance, no struggle, only compliance. This was not a random interception. It was a calculated move executed under a federal arrest warrant issued weeks earlier and nearing expiration. Miss the window and the ship and its cargo would vanish again into the maze of global shipping lanes. The boarding itself was legally rare. Physical interdictions of oil tankers in international waters are extraordinary acts reserved for moments when evidence is overwhelming and the stakes are geopolitical. For the Trump administration, this marked a turning point. Sanctions were no longer confined to paperwork and press releases. This was enforcement by presence, a message delivered by helicopter blades and federal authority. A floating node in a global sanctions-evading network had finally been stopped, not by banks or brokers, but by boots on steel decks. The vessel seized that morning was called Skipper, a very large crude carrier, a VLCC, designed to move immense volumes of oil across oceans. Built in 2005, it belonged to a generation of tankers engineered for endurance rather than transparency. Ships of this size can carry over 1 million barrels of crude in a single voyage, making them economic powerhouses when operating legally, and devastating tools when operating outside the system. Before it was known as Skipper, the vessel sailed under another name, Adisa. The change was not cosmetic, it was strategic. Older tankers like this dominate the shadow fleet because they are cheap, depreciated, and expendable. Their operators accept risk in exchange for profit, knowing that losing one ship is survivable if the margins are high enough. But even for sanctioned networks, AVLCC matters. One seized cargo can erase months of revenue. One interdiction can disrupt entire routing chains. The Skipper wasn't just a ship, it was a logistical artery, and its capture sent shockwaves far beyond its hull. Skipper's journey into illegality wasn't sudden. In November 2022, when it still operated as Adisa, the U.S. Treasury placed the vessel under sanctions through the Office of Foreign Assets Control. Investigators had already traced it to a complex oil smuggling network linked to sanctioned actors operating across multiple jurisdictions. At the center of that web was Viktor Artemov, a figure accused of coordinating maritime routes that moved oil on behalf of Iran's most powerful paramilitary institutions. The ship was tied directly to the transport of crude, benefiting Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Quds Force, and Hezbollah. These weren't commercial shipments, they were financial lifelines. Oil was being blended, relabeled, and routed through shell companies designed to erase its origin and destination alike. Yet sanctions alone failed to stop the operation. Paper restrictions collided with real-world loopholes, offshore registries, compliant intermediaries, and flags of convenience. The Skipper continued sailing, continued loading, continued delivering, until December 2025, when the gap between designation and enforcement finally closed. The Skipper was not an anomaly, it was a component of what analysts call the shadow fleet, sometimes known as the dark fleet, a global armada of tankers operating deliberately beyond transparency. These ships exist because sanctioned states still need revenue, and oil remains the fastest way to generate it. Iran, Venezuela, and Russia rely on this system to bypass financial restrictions imposed by Western governments. The fleet is composed largely of aging vessels, owned through obscure corporate structures, insured through questionable providers, and operated at the margins of maritime law. Risks are high, accidents go underreported, accountability is thin. Enforcement is difficult because the ocean is vast and jurisdiction is fragmented. Tracking data can be manipulated. Ownership can be hidden. Cargoes can change identity mid-voyage. A ship flagged in one country, owned in another, crewed by a third, and operating in international waters becomes a legal puzzle few states are willing to solve. Globally, hundreds of vessels are believed to participate in this system. Together, they move millions of barrels of oil every day. Skipper was one of them, until it wasn't. Every large vessel at sea is required to broadcast its location through an automatic identification system, or AIS. It's a digital heartbeat, position, speed, identity, transmitted continuously for safety and transparency. Under international law, disabling or manipulating it is a red flag. For Skipper, it became a pattern. Investigators later determined that the ship had falsified its location repeatedly, sometimes for weeks at a time. Public tracking data showed it docking at ports it never visited: Iraq, Egypt, Ghana, Nigeria. Meanwhile, satellite imagery told a different story, one of secret loading operations in Iran and Venezuela. Over 80 days of spoofing were documented across multiple regions. The vessel appeared where it wasn't and disappeared where it mattered most. This wasn't a technical failure, it was a deliberate deception. AIS spoofing signals intent. It tells authorities that a ship does not want to be seen. And in maritime enforcement, that intent carries weight. For Skipper, the digital lies became physical evidence, and ultimately, part of the justification for its seizure. Skipper's routes formed a quiet triangle across half the globe. It loaded crude at Karg Island in Iran, a heavily monitored export terminal tied directly to the country's sanctioned oil trade. Months later, satellite images placed the vessel at the port of Jose in Venezuela, taking on millions of barrels of discounted crude from another sanctioned state. But the oil rarely traveled cleanly from point A to point B. Offshore transfers blurred origins. Cargoes were blended at sea. Documentation changed hands. By the time the oil reached Asia, its identity had been erased. China stood at the far end of the pipeline. As the world's largest energy importer, it became the primary destination for discounted sanctioned crude. Customs declarations often misrepresented the origin. Labels were altered. Payments are routed through intermediaries. Why tolerate the system? Because the economics are compelling. Deep discounts cushion domestic demand. Strategic ambiguity avoids confrontation. And enforcement remains someone else's problem until it isn't. Skipper was one of many ships feeding this invisible corridor. Its seizure briefly illuminated a trade that normally operates in shadows, connecting sanctioned producers to willing buyers across oceans. Ship-to-ship transfers are not illegal by default. In legitimate trade, they are rare but lawful. In the shadow fleet, they become something else entirely. Skipper was repeatedly observed conducting transfers offshore, mid-sea exchanges that left no port records and minimal paperwork. Satellite imagery confirmed these operations near Venezuela's coast and later in the Caribbean. One vessel would arrive laden with crude, another would depart carrying cargo whose origin was now ambiguous. Identity dissolved somewhere between hulls. These transfers matter because oil is traceable until it isn't. Once mixed or moved, chemical fingerprints fade behind documentation. Analysts flag such behavior because it mirrors known sanction evasion tactics used across multiple regimes. For Skipper, ship-to-ship transfers weren't occasional. They were systematic. And in the quiet space between vessels, legality slipped into smuggling. At the time of its capture, Skipper claimed to sail under the flag of Guyana. The government of Guyana quickly denied it. The ship was not registered. The flag was false. False flagging is more than deception. It's a legal vulnerability. Under international maritime law, vessels without legitimate national registration are considered stateless, and stateless ships enjoy fewer protections on the high seas. That distinction mattered. It strengthened the U.S. authority to board and seize the vessel in international waters. No sovereign state could credibly intervene. No flag state could protest. For shadow fleet operators, false flags offer cover until they don't. When exposed, they become an invitation for enforcement. Skipper crossed that threshold long before December 2025. The seizure simply made it official. On paper, Skipper belonged to Triton Navigation Corp., registered in the Marshall Islands, a jurisdiction favored for minimal disclosure and regulatory distance. Its beneficial operator was listed as Tomaros Global Ventures, based in Nigeria. Together, they formed a familiar pattern. These jurisdictions aren't chosen randomly. They offer opacity, they complicate enforcement, they allow ownership to shift without scrutiny. Behind them, investigators believe, sat a network linked to Viktor Artemov, coordinating vessels, managers, and cargoes across borders. Front companies insulated the real beneficiaries. Payments moved through layers. Responsibility dissolved across paperwork. When something went wrong, no single entity appeared accountable. This corporate fog is the backbone of the shadow fleet. Skipper was just one node, but removing a node exposes a structure and invites others to reconsider the risk. Oil is not neutral when its proceeds are weaponized. In Iran's case, a significant portion of export funds the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, a parallel power structure with its own budget, command, and foreign operations. The Quds Force in particular relies on off-book revenues to support allied militias abroad. Hezbollah is one such beneficiary. Funds generated through oil sales move through networks like the one Skipper served, eventually reaching paramilitary operations far from any oil terminal. For Tehran, this model matters. Roughly one-third of Iranian oil exports are tied directly to IRGC-controlled channels. Interrupting shipping doesn't just reduce revenue, it disrupts planning, payroll, and logistics. That's why seizures hurt more than sanctions. Financial penalties can be absorbed. Physical losses cannot. A captured ship means lost oil, lost time, and lost confidence. Skipper's seizure struck at the infrastructure of illicit funding, not its paperwork. For Venezuela, oil is survival. Under sweeping sanctions, the Maduro government has leaned heavily on shadow trade to keep revenue flowing. Washington accuses Caracas of using oil exports to sustain what it calls a narco-terrorist regime, allegations Maduro rejects outright. After the seizure, Venezuelan state media called it piracy, an act of imperial aggression, but beneath the rhetoric lay economic reality. Venezuela has been selling its crude at steep discounts, sometimes $15 below market price, just to keep buyers interested. Sanctions have hollowed out formal channels. Shadow fleets filled the gap. Ships like Skipper became essential, not optional. At the same time, Washington escalated pressure. New sanctions targeted Maduro's inner circle, family members, business partners, shipping firms. The message was cumulative. Oil would no longer move unnoticed. For Caracas, the seizure wasn't symbolic. It was existential. Within days of the seizure, Moscow reacted. President Vladimir Putin spoke directly with Nicolas Maduro, expressing solidarity and reaffirming support. The statement was brief but deliberate. Russia understands shadow fleets. It operates one of its own. Sanction evasion tactics, false flags, ship transfers, opaque ownership, mirror those used by Iran and Venezuela. The systems overlap, the incentives align. Backing Caracas wasn't just ideological, it was strategic. A successful U.S. interdiction sets a precedent, and precedents spread. For Moscow, supporting Venezuela meant signaling resistance, not only to sanctions, but to enforcement itself. Sanctioned oil sells cheaply. Iran discounts its crude by roughly $8 per barrel. Venezuela by as much as $15. When global oil prices hover near $60, those reductions matter. Costs pile up fast. Chartering a VLCC like Skipper can exceed $100,000 per day, more when carrying sanctioned cargo. Add ship-to-ship transfers, add falsified paperwork, add intermediaries and insurance premiums. Margins shrink. Pressure mounts. For Iran, the timing is fragile. Oil revenues are down. The rial is weakening. Inflation is rising. Holding millions of barrels at sea costs money every day. Seizing a ship doesn't just remove supply, it accelerates financial stress. And stress reshapes decisions. For years, sanctions were largely symbolic. Financial barriers enforced by banks and compliance officers. The Skipper seizure changed that equation. It demonstrated willingness to intervene physically, not just economically. Under the Trump administration's renewed pressure campaign, enforcement moved from spreadsheets to sea lanes. Lawmakers questioned transparency. What was the end game? How far would this go? The White House offered few details, but actions spoke clearly. Officials signaled more seizures, more interdictions, more risk for tanker owners and buyers who assumed distance provided safety. The message was unmistakable. Sanctioned oil is no longer untouchable once it leaves port. For shipping companies, insurers, and traders, the calculus shifted overnight. Profit now had to be weighed against helicopters, warrants, and international exposure. This wasn't escalation by rhetoric, it was an escalation by presence. The shadow fleet persists because demand persists. As long as buyers exist, ships will follow. Enforcement can disrupt routes, but rarely eliminate systems overnight. Vessel shortages may increase. Risks may rise. Some operators will exit. Others will adapt. But every seizure raises costs. Every interdiction narrows margins. Every exposure forces recalculation. There is danger in escalation. Miscalculations at sea carry consequences. Maritime enforcement sits at the edge of geopolitics. Skipper's seizure didn't end the shadow fleet, but it proved it could be touched. And in global power dynamics, touch changes everything. The Skipper was more than the steel and oil. It was a loophole given form. Its capture revealed how quietly power moves across water and how suddenly it can be stopped. History rarely announces turning points. Sometimes it arrives by helicopter. If this story mattered, stay with us. Subscribe for what comes next.